A key task for any government is to determine which policies to enact and how to implement them. To this end, many governments have engaged in some form of policy experimentation, but few episodes can compare with China's systematic undertaking over the past 4 decades. Since the 1980s, the Chinese government has routinely trialed a wide array of policies at the local level before deciding whether to launch them nationwide, and this process of extensive experimentation has been credited as a critical mechanism driving the country's economic rise. This paper describes the structure of China's policy experimentation, while also elucidating how that structure affects policy learning and outcomes. The authors build a dataset comprising over 19,000 government documents, which together cover 652 policy experiments conducted between 1980 and 2020. These data trace the system's top-down approach. For each experiment, the central government document that introduces the policy and outlines the overall experimentation guidelines is linked to all corresponding local government documents that record its local implementation and, if deemed successful, the subsequent national rollout. Over this period, 42% of policy experiments ultimately became national policies. These data reveal 3 key facts about China's policy experimentation. Fact 1 is that experimentation sites are not representative. Comparing the pre-experimentation characteristics of localities that are chosen as experimentation sites versus those that are not reveals that nearly 90% of experiments are conducted in sites that are positively selected in terms of local economic conditions. Experimentation sites are on average 44.2% richer in terms of local fiscal revenue than non-experimentation sites, and this pattern extends to characteristics specifically pertinent to each policy domain. So, for example, agricultural policy experiments take place in areas with higher pre-experimentation agricultural output. Experiments with government finance and tax policies take place in areas with higher local fiscal revenue, and experiments with population and health policies take place in areas with larger populations. In and of itself, positive selection is not necessarily problematic, but if the central government does not take it into account when evaluating experimentation outcomes, it can bias policy learning, a point we will return to. Fact 2 is that, in addition to experimentation sites not being representative, experimental situations are also not representative. Local politicians who participate in successful policy experiments, that is, those that lead to national rollouts, are substantially more likely to get promoted. This, in turn, leads them to exert a special effort to enhance experimentation outcomes. They increase local fiscal expenditures specific to the policy domain on trial once experimentation begins, and this dynamic is especially pronounced for politicians who face stronger promotion incentives. Tellingly, these increased expenditures cease once experimentation ends, and, of broader concern, there is no similar increase in local fiscal support when policies roll out nationwide. This indicates that experiments create additional incentives and induce extra efforts among local politicians that can influence experimentation outcomes, but are not replicable outside the experiment. Finally, fact 3 is that the central government is not fully sophisticated when interpreting experimentation outcomes. Random shocks that affect local socioeconomic conditions during experiments, but that are themselves independent of the policies on trial, nonetheless affect the government's decisions on which policies to expand nationally. For example, changes in national interest rates affect the overall demand for real estate, which leads to local fiscal windfalls in counties whose topographies happen to be suitable for converting agricultural land into residential zones. These windfalls improve local conditions, but they are entirely incidental to any ongoing policy experiment and should therefore be discounted when evaluating experimentation outcomes. Yet the authors find a robust relationship between the incidence of these shocks and the central government's rollout decisions, indicating that at least some of their impact on local outcomes is being misattributed to the experimental policy's effectiveness. Having documented these three facts, what are the implications for policy learning and outcomes? If the government's objective when experimenting is to estimate a policy's average effect were it to be implemented nationwide, the presence of positive selection and strategic efforts could bias learning and impact outcomes. For one, it may lead experimental outcomes to be considerably larger than what might be expected once a policy is expanded nationwide. To investigate how the government makes its decisions, this figure shows the relationship between different estimators of experimentation outcomes and national rollout decisions. The first estimator ignores both positive selection and strategic efforts and is strongly predictive of which policies are expanded nationally. The more sophisticated estimators are not. This suggests that the government is not, in fact, accounting for these sources of bias when making its decisions, and accordingly, the authors find that over 70% of policies originating from experimentation experience shrinkage in policy effects once they are rolled out to the entire country. There are also distributional consequences. Localities that are more similar to experimentation sites benefit significantly more from these policies. This raises the concern that because sites are positively selected, experimentation may produce a set of policies that systematically favor richer regions with more incentivized politicians at the expense of their less developed and less incentivized counterparts. Thus, this paper highlights the complex political and institutional contexts that shape China's policy experimentation. While these results shed light on factors that may undermine policy learning in this setting, they do not speak to the overall costs and benefits of experimentation versus no experimentation at all. This and other questions, such as how the government decides which policies are trialed, are left for future work. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. This includes a large theoretical literature on policy experimentation, including papers focused particularly on China, as well as research on policy learning and scale-up.